Happy heresies and welcome to the desert of the real. My name is Miguel Connor and I am your Pompidus of Gnosis. Yes, and I am in a different place right now. The Tech Archon struck right before I was getting everything ready in the study and my PC went down. So now I am working from another PC on the other side of the house. We do what we can. Yes, a little bit of traffic with dogs and cats and children, but the show must go on. And I hope you enjoyed that little intro, since I think from Carrie, since we will be dealing with some haunting themes today. Good to see everybody. I hope everybody's having a good summer Tuesday. And as always, if you have any questions for our guest, please super chat them. And our guest today, for a second time, it is honored to have Daniel Bourke. This time he will be discussing his new book, Telepathic Tales, Precognitions and Clairvoyance in Legend, Lyric, and Lore. Daniel, thank you very much for coming on again.
And thank you very much for having me on again. Looking forward to the conversation.
Always. I really enjoyed your last book and interview, Apparitions at the Moment of Death. And this seems to be an extension, but a lot of good stuff that I really enjoyed. And with us too, we are joined by Graham. Graham, how are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing very good, Miguel. Dogs and cats and children. Oh my.
Oh, that famous speech from Ghostbusters. Yeah. The apocalypse and dogs and cats will get along and all that. So good to see you. I think when you might want to put yourself on mute, Graham, when I'm talking, I can hear the echo. There you go. Perfect. Perfect.
Can I say that intro just completely vibed me out? I don't even know what to say. It was brilliant.
It is. I must admit, I got it from somewhere on the internets, and it just It just seemed perfect.
Put me in a different place.
There you go. That's what we're all about here. Indeed. So, Daniel, well, let's start with you. Why did you decide to write this book? I think last time when we talked, you did say that you got so much research on your other book, excellent research, that there was so much left over. Is this an extension, or how did this book come about?
Yeah, it's interesting because the first book was my first ever book, Apparitions at the Moment of Death. So, like, I didn't like have a concept really of how a book necessarily even comes to be. So, but that one was very purposeful after a certain point. But it was during the research for that book that I just started to realize in my kind of travels through the texts, through the folklore, through the myths, that like there's a lot here. There's a lot more here in terms of my main interest, which is veridical visions. So visions, dreams, and other intimations that have some sort of external corollary. So some sort of, bearing on the external world, something along the lines of a synchronicity, for example, but not always quite that. So I just kind of realized, and I started realizing that it wasn't just that many of these veridical visions and dreams were kind of jumping out at me. Many of them were jumping out at me that were from aspects of the paranormal in general that are kind of overlooked, kind of less researched. That's both in the general sense and absolutely from a cross-cultural historical perspective. So for instance, just for one example, the likes of the Scandinavian Vardogr takes up the first chapter, or what I call general visions of a visitor's arrival. There's been very little work done on those types of experiences. So I just started kind of putting these chapters together, and it came about. We have a second book. What can I say? It's a kind of a problem I have, actually, because there was way more research left over for this one too. So as you can imagine, there's another one coming.
I figured there'd be a trilogy. These things
problem.
come in threes, as they say. So yeah, we want to get more into the Varda. There's the dog barking, of course, in the kitchen. Always has to be. So why do you think that scholars have missed it? Because you bring so much data, you show a universality to this concept. Why do you think it really had? The truth is, it hasn't really been what's, for lack of better words, faced.
It's so true. Where do I begin on that question? Because I would say that, like, for whatever reason, well, first of all, what's interesting is that I want to say that all of these accounts in this first chapter, they're not all typical Vardogrs. Many of them are, but many of them are just more general visions and dreams of a visitor's arrival. And I tie those together with the Vardogr phenomenon. And I even conclude the possibility that ultimately we could call them every single example in this Vardogr, because the ultimate meaning of a Vardogr is a premonitory sight or sound. And I kind of come to the conclusion that maybe we could relate that to dreams, because in some sense we are citing them if they're veridical dreams. But that's besides your question, which is more, I think, like in the very earliest days of kind of parapsychological research with the Society for Psychical Research, they were very concerned with what far less mundane types of experiences, okay, like death, crisis, accidents. I think that, along with the later focus that came on the experimental side of extrasensory perception, like the parapsychologists went very strongly in the direction of experimental design and trying to appease the methods and kind of scientific methods of the day, etc. And that carried on for decades. And then J.B. Ryan with his experiments, and then the card experiments with.
Right.
I think that speaks to it to some extent, because even where you do see these accounts referenced, and this is something I note in the book, even where you do see these accounts referenced, you don't see the actual Vardogr itself referenced. The connection isn't made. In fact, this as a phenomenon, I see it as just a kind of a universal human phenomenon but it doesn't seem to have really been recognized at all in general. And even the likes of Frederick Myers, who writes about so-called arrival cases of this kind. No notice to the Vardogger. The same with the likes of, I think, William Craigie, the philologist, was one of the only ones I could come up with that really knew about the phenomenon. And then even others like the Andrew Kirk, who wrote about who wrote a book, the famous book, Fairies, Fauns, and the Secret Commonwealth, reference cases of this kind, but again, no mention of the Norse counterparts. So why exactly? I think it's all of those things, but I also think it's a general, and forgive me if I'm going on here, but I think it's a general kind of disinterest that there has been in more mundane extrasensory phenomena in general, and I think those are something that need to be paid more attention to.
Yeah,
When I
I
say mundane in
agree.
the relative sense, sorry.
Yeah, I agree. Even though it's in all these tales that we know about ancient, in the West, ancient Greek myths, historical myths, your book connects to all this lore from Mesoamerica to Asia and so forth, is this idea of our supramundane senses. And it's all there, both in myth and history, too. Do you think maybe it's just sort of our enlightenment materialist attitude that we don't want to accept, even though doesn't make sense, because very empirical materialistic people like Sigmund Freud, Mark Twain, and so forth, they all believed in telepathy. You just look at nature, and animals seem to have, plants seem to have telepathy, but and precognition and all that, but suddenly it just went away. Do you think maybe that we just don't want to face that there's more than our brain, that it's all localized?
I would say that, like, fundamentally, well, when it comes to psychology, like, and when it comes to the kind of real influential individuals, like, as you mentioned, Freud, and psychology very purposely took a turn away from parapsychology. It very specifically wished less association with parapsychology historically, even though the two are very much intertwined. And parapsychology borrowed from the methods of psychology, but it actually went both ways. And it's interesting, like, psychology is one of the better placed realms of inquiry to deal with parapsychological phenomenon. There is a great historical irony to their separation in that regard. And I also ironically, like, psychologists are some of the least likely educators to believe in the paranormal also. But yet, and this speaks to your point, yet they're also some of the least familiar with the literature itself. So in some sense, I think the answer to your question is simply A, it is hard to make generalizations in this area, but I will say that A, philosophical bias is the fundamental problem. I mean, if I remember correctly, it was one of the reports, there was a kind of a skeptical external scientist brought in to review some of the work that the Navy did on remote viewing. And if I could remember the quote, it's something along the lines of, when he came across this, he couldn't find anything necessarily methodologically wrong. But he basically concluded, even if this were true, I don't think I would believe it. And I think that kind of sums up the approach. And I think it sums up the answer. Something relating to the answer to your question is that the irony, of course, is that there is great belief in these phenomena, these Pew polls, these Gallup polls over the years. I mean, there was just a recent paper actually showing, I think it was some very high number of belief in general supernatural and extrasensory phenomenon in England, higher than was expected. And there's been actually not enough work done in relation to those beliefs in England. But yeah, it's more about Western academia and its basic materialist biases that you speak about that don't allow them to necessarily even consider the phenomenon for what they may or may not be.
I would agree. Yes, the gatekeepers, those who keep humanity like ostriches with heads in our sand, where we don't see such a greater reality and the wonder and magic of just being a human being. So, and I mean, like I said, somebody like Mark Twain, he was very, he had things to say about religion, but he used to play the game of, predicting the mail that would come, and he'd get it right. He famously had his vision where he had a dream of his brother in a casket, and it came true. And so this was,
Yeah.
again, it was there. It's all there. Just the scientists of the other era seem to have been wiser. And there's all these great examples in your book. Here, I have this right here. I took this from your book. This is a quote by Jung. He says, "The unconscious helps by communicating things to us or making figurative illusions. It has other ways, too, of informing us of things which all logic we could not possibly know."
Mm.
And I think Papa Jung is empirically right. He's 100% right. And your example in the book of he having one of those, I love it. Tell the audience about that one, of course.
Well, Jung had, well, his entire concept of synchronicity is very amenable to psi phenomenon. Like, there have been arguments that I would say that the best way to speak to the relationship between synchronicity and psi is that some synchronicities can be psi related, and some some experiences of psi can be synchronistic, but it's not all either or. And Jung was kind of different to Freud in the sense that he had many experiences of this kind in his own life. That was one of the things missing from Freud, although he did have, I think, one specifically regarding a pregnancy where it wasn't him, though. It was a patient of his, I believe, who became aware of a distant conception regarding, or birth regarding, twins, and it kind of surprised Freud to the extent that he found it hard not to take these phenomena seriously. But yeah, the Carl Jung had many, as I say, different examples of this kind, and I believe he had a near-death experience. But one of those was when he in his own, among many of his different experiences, I should say, he was riding a train home from Switzerland during the Second World War. He found himself overpowered, quote unquote, with the image of someone drowning. And upon reaching his destination, he discovered his youngest son had nearly drowned. And he said, "This was at exactly the time I had been assailed by that memory in the train." And it was just before that, the quote you mentioned, that came just kind of around that same time. And that's the thing about these experiences, is that it's very challenging. It's extremely challenging to kind of impart the assuredness that they give outside of the individual. Like, when you have an experience like that, there is a type of assuredness and knowing that is hard to impart, such that it's hard for others, if they're even remotely skeptical, to kind of really get on board with. But I'm open to the possibility, and I always have been, that it may always be ultimately futile to try and fully bring psi phenomena and other strange anomalous cognition into the realm of and complete materialistic objectivity. It may be impossible. It may just be the case that these are phenomenon between minds, between node points of consciousness, that kind of are just extremely challenging to fully kind of bring into the realms of, again, objective materialist science. It's not to say we shouldn't do anything in that area, but it's just a possibility that I've considered.
Yeah, I mean, it's objectively happening, or as you would say, it's empirically happening. As Gordon White said, magic is about probabilities. So it's putting it in a laboratory or anything else. Although, of course, there have been studies and all that we can look at. I guess a lot of it is the purpose of it, right, Daniel? I mean, why do these things happen when somebody has a vision in their deathbed? Or your example of Hans Berger, the inventor of the electroencephalography, was so impacted by his sister's premonition of his accident that he dedicated his life research to finding the energy responsible for telepathy. So sometimes there's a lesson there. Sometimes it's a reminder that that reality is a lot more brittle than we think. Sometimes it's our higher self or the gods warning us. But yeah, there's many reasons, and it's still a mystery here in our little monkey bodies.
It's interesting. Yeah, the Hans Berger account is interesting because it speaks to the kind of separation between the experiencer and the others, because it's these types of experiences very often they are what actually kind of drive people down this path in the first place. and that includes many different psychologists. Like there have been many psychologists and psychoanalysts who have begun to take these phenomena more seriously due to experiences between themselves and their patients, for example, or other types of experiences. Like Elizabeth Lloyd Mayer, for example, wrote a book called Extraordinary Knowing. It's a really, really interesting book. I'd recommend to anyone interested in these types of topics. And she speaks about, and this ties into the book also, because I have a chapter in the book called Treasure Tombs and Visionary Boons, which deals with extrasensory perception relating to the location of lost items, and I kind of extend it to general finding of things through cultures and time. And it was an experience of that kind which actually drove Elizabeth Lloyd Mayer who to really pursue these topics. And like when you read a book like Extraordinary Knowing, it's just extremely well written, such nuance, great research, amazing context brought to bear. You realize what such a seemingly small thing, like the experience was basically that her daughter had lost her harp and they couldn't find it anywhere. And as a kind of a joke, her friend asked Elizabeth to maybe just consider a dowser. Okay, now Elizabeth is a materialist psychoanalyst at the time, and she genuinely took it on as a joke and said, "Okay, I'll do it as a joke." The dowser found the harp for Elizabeth, according to her. And when you read a book like this and realize it's the result of such a seemingly mundane experience, that's when you start to realize that it's hard to get across exactly what these experiences can do to the individual, compared to just hearing about them, for example. And your point again about, the experimentation and then anecdote and just this strange, one of the strange, I think we have a very strange attitude and kind of hypocrisy towards the anecdote as a general concept. I mean, people are happy, like scientists are happy to accept anecdotes when it relates to, certain kind of clinical and psychological areas. They're happy to, without going down that road too much, I'll just say that all anecdotes are not equal. We cannot dismiss anecdotes as a general concept out of hand. It's completely intellectually reprehensible, and it just has no bearing on rational thought at all, in my opinion. The source of the anecdote, the extent to which it comports with other anecdotes. In my opinion, the anecdote itself is an extremely powerful tool to in inductive reasoning, in what's called abductive reasoning, the preponderance of evidence as relates to the most likely explanation. So I do consider anecdotes as data. I hate that old trope that anecdotes are not data. I think it's in fact, that the meaning of that was actually, it was flipped on its head. I can't remember the details of it, but Patricia Pearson actually describes this in the introduction to my first book, where the meaning of that quote was flipped on its head and turned around. It doesn't really mean that. It was meant to its opposite. But again, the very last point on this is that anecdotos from Greece, from some of the Greek, actually means a published narrative. So these are not, these are published narratives. So they're not, unpublished narratives. So when they're published, they're not anecdotes anymore. So if we want to get even technical and semantical, we can do that. But basically, yeah, let's listen to what people say and see if it's strangely similar to what other people say. There may be some meaning to that.
Yeah, I would agree. And the other theme of your book, too, is the idea, of course, going into the veils of death. People who have premonitions about their death, that's a classic one. Deathbed visions and so forth. What are some of the stories you like the most that you want to share with the audience, or what themes do you see with all this evidence that you found?
Well, one of the, it's funny, one of the very interesting phenomena that I came across when I kept pouring through the kind of literature was premonitions of one's own death. Okay, and this is very interesting to me. For instance, here's a quote from the chapter, from the opening from the chapter on this. It's called "A Day with Destiny," and it says, "Prognostication in Western medicine has traditionally been based on objective scientific criteria. Yet providers often rely on a feeling or sense based on experience to provide prognoses. In trauma, some providers believe that patients who express a feeling of death are more likely to die. There are extremely strange, mysterious examples across the board, whether it's in emergency rooms, whether it's in hospices, care homes, of people seeming to come into a very specific awareness of not just the general fact they will die, not just the general time they will die, but the exact time that they will die. And this is very mysterious because even today for physicians, it's essentially impossible to do that. It's essentially impossible to predict the day that somebody is going to die. And these are extremely widespread attestations. Peter Fenwick says they know for whatever reason they have a prescience. It's a definite feeling they have that they are going to die. And I would say 95% of the time they end up dying in front of me, and it's very disturbing to me. You have so many of these cases. There was I believe it was an ambulance technician. I became interested, he said, in the mechanism of death in the elderly while serving in the nursing home, particularly in those patients who predicted their death was imminent. They would say, "I'm ready to die." And there was very little the physician could do to prevent it. There was usually, this is what's very interesting too, there was usually no obvious lethal disease process at the time. The electrocardiogram might be normal, the chest x-ray normal, the screening blood tests all normal, and yet death would occur usually within 24 to 48 hours. This made me very uneasy and continues to make me uneasy when I sign death certificates under cause of death because I don't really know why they died. Now, that's where it gets so fascinating. And I won't go too much on this question other than to say that is also, what I find interesting is that's something that I also found in the tales. I found that in the tales, whether it's the medieval tales, the older tales from China, for example, these cases where the individual predicts their death, it's often specified there too that there was no necessary sign they were going to die, or that there was a surprise from the doctor's side that they were going to die, etc. So when I look for these accounts through time, I find it interesting not only to find the analogs, but the actual kind of idiosyncrasies that attend them seem to turn up also, which I find quite interesting and worthy of further exploration.
Yeah, it is. It really is truly fascinating. I think there's somebody in the chat said, yeah, you wrote about that in your book, Miguel, talking about Philip K. Dick and Elvis. And yes, in my book, I do discuss how Elvis and Philip K. Dick had visions and premonitions of their death almost to the day. So again, this is and of course, then I have a chapter on all Elvis visitations, people when they're dying in hospitals, he appears and all that. So it's such a rich tapestry that is happening right now, and I'm so happy you're there collecting all of this work.
Yeah, I appreciate that. There's so much it's out there. For instance, you can go to Australia, Polynesia, the Philippines. It doesn't matter. You'll find these same accounts, and that goes for everything in the book. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I know for a fact that every single account in this book is exactly what it claims to be. But I would argue that there are so many that it would be entirely unreasonable to disregard them all as not what they claim to be. And that's especially in light of how particularly they mirror their analogs that have been collected so carefully by parapsychologists over the past 100 years, 200 years, etc., etc. It's in that context that we do have to start taking these things more seriously. And I think that historians of religion need to look into these phenomena far more deeply. Like, for instance, I keep coming back to the lives of the saints. So many phenomena in the lives of the saints are, again, just indistinguishable from those recorded by parapsychological researchers. And there are so many saints that have come up with the exact day they would die, then they happen to die. And I always say, like, there's nothing controversial. It's entirely incontroversial to say that the biographers of the saints, they don't necessarily implement these types of experiences willy-nilly. They take into account the kind of cultural milieu of the time. They take into account the oral tales in the surrounding areas, the folklore, the folk beliefs. These are things that would have been known. And let me be clear, implemented into the life of the saint in his biography as something that maybe didn't actually happen, but in many cases, again, these things actually did happen, then were recorded later or at the deathbed. But yeah, I just think it's important to make a note of that, because people often look at these stories in those types of sources and just they have the instinct to dismiss them offhand. And because they're in the context of the saint's life, where, for example, you will find miracles that are unlikely to be possible That's just the truth. It's very unlikely some of these mirrors are possible, but by no means is that the case for all of them. And yeah, there's a lot more out there to be found, and I think especially historians of religion should look further into this. And a guy called Carlos Era wrote an excellent book called They Flew recently, and it deals with levitating and bilocating saints through time and how the beliefs persisted through the Reformation, etc. It's a fascinating book. I think it's certainly not going to be a first step into some sort of amazing new open,
Right.
embracing of these phenomena, but I think it will spawn a lot of very interesting work, even if sporadically in the next decade.
Oh, indeed, for sure. Yeah, you even bring up Saint Augustine, who relates that he had a patient. He was a doctor who predicted when he was going to show up to visit him.
Oh, that was the case. Was that the case of the arrival or at the deathbed?
No, arrival. Yeah, it wasn't anything with death. He
Okay,
predicted,
yeah.
his patient predicted when he would show up, and Augustine was very like, whoa.
Yes, I think this was the case. Okay, yeah, where I think Eric Dodds put this. I think wrote about Augustine in a psychical context. Eric Dodds was a scholar a classicist who was very interested in the work of psychical researchers, and in many ways took it very seriously. And he actually wrote a paper. If I remember correctly, the name of it is Telepathy and Clairvoyance in Classical Antiquity. It's one of the kind of earlier papers dealing with attempting to find examples of these types of phenomena that were being contemporaneously collected by psychical researchers and compare the two. Now, he was quite skeptical, I think overly skeptical. He was a little bit cold on the idea that we could casually compare. But I think that I think that it was a kind of I think that type of opinion is also a part of the product of the time, again, where parapsychology was so very concerned with presenting its best academic face. I really, really see that a lot. And to be honest, I would say that lessened over the decades, but I do think there's maybe still just a little tiny bit too much pandering in that regard. I do think that there doesn't have to be, I'm not, don't get it mistaken. I'm not saying let's not present scientific work and work to these methods. I'm just saying that I think there can be too much of an emphasis on gaining the approval of the greater scientific community when you're not necessarily dealing with people who are inherently receptive to such things at all. You may be waiting decades. You may be waiting another 100 years. I wouldn't pin anything on that. Is my only point. And yeah, I got all that somehow I got to there from the Dodds reference, but I'll try and reel it back in. I think this was the quote. He said that Augustine of Hippo deserves a more honorable place in the history of psychical research, and that was in reference to how many strange dreams, visions, vertical visions that he recorded in his works. And like there was one from late antiquity involving a priest who would commonly visit a quote-unquote hysterical patient after a 12-mile journey. And this speaks back again to the first chapter. This patient would habitually recognize the very moment at which the priest was setting out to visit and would describe exactly all the stages of his journey. Now, that type of account, I do have the book in front of me here, and I have an analogous account from more recently. It's basically the exact same thing. And it's from a collection of folklore where a sick man, and it's interesting again, I keep getting sidetracked in my own thoughts because it's interesting again that it's kind of clarified that he's ill, because a lot of these things often do occur when people are kind of ill or in an altered state of consciousness. And I mentioned this in the first interview. That actually also comes out in the texts, and I find that fascinating that comes out in the texts. But yeah, that was it's the type of story again where it's from his literal commentary on Genesis, one of his more famous works, and you could just look at it and kind of think, that's cool. It was probably just I don't know. It probably doesn't mean anything. But if you look at literally 500 other accounts of people saying they're doing the same thing from every continent in every age at all times, if that doesn't make you scratch your head a little bit, and the reality is it doesn't make people scratch their heads. That's the truth. A lot of people, they just don't find it interesting at all. That a lot of people are saying the same things across cultures and time. But I absolutely found it interesting enough to compile these accounts. So I hope other people do too.
Definitely, for sure. Yeah, Augustine, I've always said he was a mystic. He was a Gnostic turncoat, but he certainly was a mystic for sure. And yes, we are talking to Daniel Bourke on his book, Telepathic Tales. If you have any questions for him or want to support Aeon Byte, please super chat them. I can always use the help. Like, subscribe. You guys know the drill. Join the Patreon. Let's keep spreading this gnosis. And for those who might be joining late, yeah, my computer went down at the last minute, so I am doing the show here from my the other end of the kitchen, and I'm glad that we are definitely doing this. So let me bring in Graham. Graham, do you have a question or a remark for Daniel?
I do. I was going to sit there and say I was very happy to hear him call out purse and abductive logic, because I think that that might be the key to all of this, where, as I wrote in the chat, anecdote is the basis of all science. But science deals with repeatable anecdote. It's when you and I can have the same anecdote over the same experiment.
Yeah.
That's when it becomes repeatable. And that's where, when you're dealing with probabilistic, you're dealing with like the quantum effects. And that's something that science has had to wrestle with in the quantum realm, where the experiment isn't necessarily entirely repeatable. It's only probabilistic. And that brings me back to thinking about Rudolf Steiner and his idea of a spiritual science. And I was going to say, what are your thoughts about the possibility of that along the lines of, almost a quantum personal experience, a quantum psychology sort of approach? Okay.
Well, I think I can speak more to the first part of your question than the second, if that's okay. Because in terms of the anecdote and the abductive reasoning, I think it's a very important point you make. Like, the thing is, like, there's this strange obsession with bringing in these specific types of scientific tools to bear with psi. But the reality is, like, abductive reasoning is used so commonly in cosmology, for example. Like, in cosmology, it was abduction that discovered the dark matter that supposedly halos around these galaxies, for example. It was abduction that kind of came up with the idea of the Big Bang based on the red shifts and the expansion, etc., etc. It's the problem is that they will I don't want to make it too us them, but like a lot of people on the kind of, let's say, philosophically materialist side of things, they kind of will not accept. They accept abductive reasoning in one area but not another. It's like we mentioned earlier with the anecdote. It's a double standard. The problem is that they don't have a problem with the abductive reasoning being used and applied to psi phenomena. They have a problem with psi phenomena. They don't think that these things are possible, so therefore they don't think it's reasonable to use abductive reasoning on something that isn't possible. So these kind of things do come through, and it comes back to my point that I mentioned earlier, in that it was those psychologists who were least willing to believe in such things that were actually least familiar with the literature. And that's just an unfortunate fact when it comes to, like, I believe it was something similar with Dr. Susan Blackmore when she was asked questions about the near-death experience on Alex Sakouras' show Skeptical. And when he was debating near-death science with her, and she came back and told him that I believe she said, I haven't kept up with the last 15 years of research. And I thought to myself, what? Why are you debating Alex on this research that's been more recent then? It's very strange. It's like this. So yeah, I can't speak too much to the quantum side of things, but I think it's interesting that you bring up the aspect of probability, because yeah, there is that deeper layer of kind of probabilistic indeterminism at the kind of basis of, quantum science, like. And it's funny because there are a few things that are funny actually in this regard, because like one of them is that, like, the deep indeterminism there, first of all, determinism itself is very common among materialists. And I find it very ironic that materialists are extremely kind of anti the idea of precognition. And I have my own ideas on precognition, but I find it funny because if things are deterministic, by definition, precognition should be entirely within reasonable possibility, because the path is already laid out. So there is a certain irony to the kind of the extent to which they're kind of turned against that idea and those types of ideas. But yeah, I don't want to go off too much off the track of your question here, so I'll hand it back.
No, thank you. I was going to say one of the examples that I see that plays into that probabilistic aspect of consciousness and experience is the Fatima experience, where you had some people who were there and they saw the dancing of the lights, and you had people like next to them that they didn't experience anything. And that's a question of, I'm not willing to deny either of their reports of their experience. The question is, how do you reconcile that into a single event? And no, Tag, go on. I'll let you go.
That would you mind if yeah, that's interesting, because like first of all, I would say it's entirely reconcilable in a few ways. Like one of the main ways would be that, and this comes out in the tales, and this especially, I will say, comes out in the first book. I dare advertise that during the second book interview, but the first book had a chapter on those who see and those who don't. And something that comes out in the tales is that there are just those that simply are endowed with greater capacity to perceive such things. It could be viewed along the lines of any type of capacity. I mean, vision itself, some people see better than others. I mean, hearing, people hear better than others. People have different talents, etc., etc. But when it comes to these types of experiences, and this comes out in the folklore, like the classic kind of grandmother in the folklore, the wise woman in the medieval tale, there's always that person who has a closer contact to these types of experiences, and often it's been the case throughout their entire lives. And what's interesting is that this comes out in the kind of modern examples too, because you often read examples of people, for instance, they will say, I'd had a dream of the person that I'm currently married to before I met them. And it turns out that a lot of the time these people say that they've actually had many experiences like that through their life, but they've never told anyone. So in some sense, they're almost emblematic of that folklore character that we referenced. They would qualify for that position if they had lived in those times, is my point. So yeah, I think that you can kind of reconcile it in that way, if at the very least in that way.
Interesting. The way I've managed to do it is the idea that we aren't interacting with the external world. We're interacting with our model of the external world in our mind. And each of the people were taking the same external input, but because they processed it slightly differently, they ended up having the different experiences and different sights of things. And that's where some of like hallucinations and stuff can come in, where you're taking the external one, and it's because of the integration between the eyes and your consciousness is somewhere it gets twisted. Okay.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that, if you allow me to be like kind of semantical there, like I do think that would still technically constitute interacting with the external world, whether or not there is that kind of filtering aspect that you bring to bear. This is why veridical phenomena are actually fundamentally so interesting, because let's imagine, like for instance, some of the critics of certain types of apparitional experience, for example, they will note what you just noted, that two people have seen two different things, therefore it has less credence. But that's missing the point entirely. If anything, that gives it more credence, because the fact is, the important fact there is that two people are seeing the same thing seeing something external at the same time, but the external thing itself actually correlates to something at a distance. So for example, I'll come back to the crisis apparitions of the first interview. Two individuals see a crisis apparition, and one of the famous cases, it was published in one of the journals of the Society for Psychical Research, and then re-examined by Celia Green and McCleary in their really excellent book on apparitions. I think it was written in 1960. And there was kind of a classic case to say, look, there was a guy who had died around the time that this person saw him on a boat on a lake going across the lake, but somebody else saw him going across the lake, but he wasn't in the boat. He was just going across the lake. But they focused in on the fact that two different things were seen rather than the fact that an external event to the individual actually correlated with the reality of a situation somewhere else. That's what's important. That's why these veridical accounts are what I find more interesting. And that's why they can be the types of accounts that can kind of cut through that mystery, that because we're always like, I remember Gregory Shushan said something that always stuck with me in one of his I think it was in his first book, near-death experiences in ancient civilizations. He said differences are always expected. It's the similarities that are important. And it's so true in cases like this. It's so true. Because the internal world of the individual is always going to have an impact on the content. Absolutely. But if anything, that's what makes the similarities even more interesting. This is what's often missed. Because like during the near-death experience, a lot of the critics will say, well, if you went to heaven, you'd see Jesus. If you went to heaven, you'd see Buddha, for example. First of all, not true. It does happen sometimes, but for the most part, it's not true. Secondly, it is true that there are ranging from little to large cultural overlays to these experiences, which in many cases during the experience are said to have been presented to the individual for the purpose of making them comfortable. That's something to keep in mind. But the point I'm making is the extent to which those two things are different between the two individuals has no bearing on the reality of the experience. And the fact is that the actual underlying pattern of the experience itself is the same between the two individuals, or indistinguishably similar depending on the account, because there are so many different near-death accounts. And that's the important thing, is the underlying pattern. And that's what's often missed by, we'll say, skeptics.
Oh, I agree 100%. What I attribute that to, and you nail it with the verticality aspect, is the mistake that a lot of the skeptic and researchers are making is the category error of not recognizing the map and the territory, the forest and the trees, where they're thinking, and that's where the perception comes in. If they think they're perceiving the external world as it really is, then they can't reconcile how two different people can do it, because they are assuming both of those people are seeing the world as it really is, and that can't be true. And so that it's that the verticality is a result of the map territory effect. It's almost like a set subset kind of thing. Just absolutely. I'm kind of rambling, so I'll let you get back on track.
I agree with that. I think that, like, basically put, like, I actually find that the in the realm of human experience and consciousness, where there is so much room for interpretation, for extrapolation, for projection, for individual kind of coloring of experience, when you put the similarities between accounts in that context, that's when it gets even more interesting. If anything, it's more interesting that these similarities persist when there is such room for what could have been the opposite. And that is the case with many types of pathological hallucinations, where things are kind of more random and strange, and kind of people's experiences vary from each other greatly. But in the realms of the near-death experience, the Christ apparition, and these Vardoggers, it's not the case. There are far too many interesting and very idiosyncratic similarities than should be reasonably ignored. It's not to say we won't come in the end and say these can all be explained in some kind of quote-unquote mundane way, but the point is to engage with the phenomena. That's the point. Because they're happening to people all the time, and they always have been, and they always will be, and they need to be a part of the conversation.
Amen, brother. And I remember interviewing Anthony Peake, and he's done a lot of work on near-death experiences too. Like you said, you mentioned his name, Dr. Gregory Shushan. He was on the show, and he's done, of course, excellent work. His podcast is great. He gives you a weekly dose of this information. But Anthony Peake was talking about in near-death experiences, somebody will be floating in the hospital, and they'll get everything. They'll describe it, but there'll be something different, like a table with a purple vase or something that's off. And of course, he brings in the parallel dimensions, which is always a good explanation, the multiverse. But again, reality itself, like Graham was saying, is pretty malleable. So things do change.
could I, yeah, if I could,
Sure.
like, there's so much to say to that point, like, because, like, you're right, there are so many experiences like that during the near-death experience, and it's such a great area to research in this regard because of the individual's mind is so compromised at the time. And uh, in these experiences, these out-of-body, these veridical aspects of the near-death experience, where the individual claims to have left their body and view things in their surroundings. Okay, so a skeptic may focus in on what you said. There's something turned out to be wrong. Okay, meanwhile, the fact that anything was right should be considered an absolute impossibility when the individual is in a state of either deeply compromised or no consciousness, either near or actual clinical death. Okay, so that's the issue there. And it's also interesting because there's so many ways you could go on this, because again, referencing Celia Green's work on apparitions with Charles McCreary, a little bit of an underrated book, but they wrote about what they called metachoric experiences. And those are experiences in which during the out-of-body experience, there is a sense that the world itself, it's not just the entire actual external environment of the individual is in some way, quote unquote, hallucinatory, and is in some way attached to the mind of the individual, as opposed to just being the external environment itself. And therefore, there are going to be some sort of changes in the environment. Now, I'm not necessarily sure that's the case in all cases, or if it's the case in any cases, but I'm saying it would be interesting if it was, because you could use that as an explanation for the types of near-death experience you referenced. And what's interesting again there is that obviously these types of metachoric experiences that Green studied were in relation to people who had a functioning brain. So if people are having these same experiences without a functioning brain, the correlation between those two experiences speaks to something strange, because if there is an experience somebody has while their brain is functioning and while their brain is not functioning, okay, obviously the fundamental experience there is the one while the brain is not functioning. It has to be the base one, because clearly a brain isn't needed to have the experience. So you could literally use that as potential evidence for the externality of consciousness, not in and of itself, but with many other examples, obviously. But yeah.
Obviously. And another idea you bring in the book, which I love, is that of Rupert Sheldrake's the morphic resonance or morphic field. That's also, like parallel universes, it's a good scientific, often testable way to see reality. And of course, yeah, we know animals can predict things ahead of time, tsunamis, earthquakes. We've all seen it, just like everybody's had, an extraordinary experience or dream. And even there was a time back when I was in the corporate world where I lived in Chicago, and it was very hard. I could never get home at the same time, but my dog always knew, according to my wife, when I would be home, because the dog would start barking, whether it was at 6 or 4:30, the dog would start barking outside.
Yeah.
And Rupert Sheldrake's work, of course, has proven that non-localized consciousness is normal in the animal world. Why not humans?
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned about your dog. I had the very same experience with my dog. The very same. He always knew when I was coming home. Didn't matter the time. He would be at the window, actually waiting at the window, and I would always knew, even if I was like 3, 4, 5 hours late, he was there. And yeah, I was so far along in the chapter that actually I didn't get to implement as much of Sheldrake's work as I would have liked to. It's excellent work, and I really want to give credit to Sheldrake, because this whole idea of researching the concept of knowing when somebody is coming, he is very much a pioneer in that area, and I just want to say that. And I actually am working on a sequel to this book at the moment, in which I do deal with only experiences relating to animals, all of the psychical experiences relating to animals through cultures and through time, and those types of experiences you referenced are going to be in there. And yeah, I think anyone who's had a very close bond with an animal will know that there seems to be something going on below the surface level. There seems to be something going on in terms of communication. Like, I mean, I remember so many times I could literally just think about the dog going for a walk, and he would just look up at me like this straight away. Just he just somehow picks up on it. But I'm not here telling you I have that scientific evidence for telepathy, but it's something that happened to me a lot. I'll say that.
It's happened to all of us. I mean, yeah, there's times I'm walking in the woods and we get somewhere and my dog will start barking like it's going out of control. And I'll look at the spot. There's no, there's no squirrel, no rabbit. There's just an empty space. And I'm like, what dimension are you seeing? What spirit are you seeing that you've just gone feral, just gone rabid?
Oh,
And,
crazy. Just out of, I understand fully. It's absolutely incredible.
yeah, they're definitely seeing another reality for sure. On a
Well,
little, go ahead.
sorry, yeah, just like that is that is also something that again comes out in the tales. Like some of the strong evidence. Like there were a lot of early psychical researchers kind of honed in on cases where animals would also react to what the human was reacting to. Like our animals would kind of lose, like you said, kind of go crazy, but it turned out that was at the time that their owner died at a distance, for example. And Sheldrake actually has a chapter on that in his work too. But yeah, this also is something that I say a lot of early psychical researchers honed in on, because one of the interests at that time also was collective apparitions. Again, like we spoke to, multiple people seeing the same thing. And again, that is something that is vastly represented in the tales, but also the animal aspect comes into that too, because those are technically collective apparitions. So yeah, it's always interesting to see if the animal reacts in the same way to the human to these types of things.
Indeed, it does. Yeah. And even again, this is something everybody's experienced. I mean, I'm thinking of the story of Michael Shermer, the great skeptic debunker. And he talks about on the day he got married, he had this broken radio, and suddenly this song came out of this broken radio, and it was his father's favorite song who had passed before the wedding and all that. Then of course he dismissed it. I mean, we tend to dismiss these things because A, we don't want to seem crazy. B, sometimes we don't want to face what's, the messages, the lessons, what's going on in the future, right? It's not, these forces are trying in a way to make us better and to see reality for what it is and to warn us. And as human beings, we got stuff to do, right, Daniel? Bills to pay, TV to watch.
It's very true. And like, I would say, like, there's a reason. It's reasonable to posit that there is a reason why these, like, for instance, sometimes I'm asked, why don't everyone have these experiences?
Right.
Like, especially when it comes to experiences that are very comforting around death, for example, visionary experiences and encounters, dreams. And I will always say, well, if this universe has, like, if there is meaning and there is mind and there is thought beyond us and there is reason and purpose and structure, like, I would suggest that there would be some very specific logic as to why everyone doesn't have these experiences. And it would be probably very pragmatic reason. Like, some people are meant to have it, some aren't. Some would benefit from it, some wouldn't. Some maybe would actually, be negatively affected by them, for example, whereas others wouldn't. And that comes back to Shermer, because you mentioned he dismissed it. It's good to say that, because I do want to be clear. Like, it's not always the case that these experiences greatly impact the individual. It is commonly the case, though, and it seems to be more often the case when they are the kind of fully recognizable form of the phenomenon. But I actually have a quote here from Shermer, if you allow me to read it, because it's fascinating to hear Michael Shermer, of all people, kind of speak. Absolutely. And he would be a skeptic who is a militant skeptic to the point of, I would argue, unreasonable to some extent, let's say.
Oh, okay. Yeah, professional debunker. He makes
more
money.
Of a professional debunker.
Yeah, he does.
Absolutely.
Yes, yeah. He bends the rules to suit the agenda. Let's be honest.
But he said, I have to admit, regarding the experience you mentioned with the radio, and he said, I have to admit, it rocked me back on my heels and shook my skepticism to its core. I savored the experience more than the explanation, which is a fascinating line. The emotional interpretation of such anomalous events grant them significance regardless of their causal account. And if we are to take seriously the scientific credo to keep an open mind and remain agnostic when the evidence is indecisive or the riddle unsolved, we should not shut the doors of perception, in reference to Huxley, when they may be open to us to marvel in the mysterious. Now, those are powerful words from somebody so skeptical. Now, I'm not somebody who will just say, oh, it's so amazing that this skeptical person said this. Now we have just what we need. I don't. It's whatever. Okay, it is what it is. But when you hear somebody that deeply skeptical say those, like he is, to me, that is Shermer saying, wait a minute. This hasn't been taken seriously enough. I've never been willing to even entertain that thought. I don't want to come out directly and say that we should research these things, but I will say he is saying keep an open mind. So I think that's an interesting and kind of it's a nice nod to the work that has been done by people in that field.
Yeah, exactly. And again, it goes back that we've all had them. We all have the capability of having them and it's again just about keeping our eyes open and being open-minded and seeing the truth for what it is. As we get to the end, I don't know that this might be a little bit of a side question. Have you seen the new movie that came out this spring called Sinners?
Sinners? No,
Yeah.
I have not.
Oh, okay. Ryan Coogler. And it's I'm actually putting out a Substack blog post today on the connection of Elvis and Sinners. And it's about, it's sort of like From Dusk Till Dawn, except in this one, you have a group of, you have an Irish vampire terrorizing Black people at a juke joint in the
Oh my
30s
God.
Mississippi. So, and it has a lot of the themes, the veils of the dead, precognition and that whole theme. It's a really good movie, and I thought, well, you should definitely check it out because here in the United States, people are the critics are so idiotic. They were like, well, this is an allegory for white supremacy, the Irish vampire, and I'm like, no, because the Irish vampire many times says, look, the same people that took your land took my father's land. We're in the same plight, but I have the solution, which is become an undead. That's his game. He wants to,
Yes.
if he can get the blacks and the Irish to be vampires, they can go kick ass. You know what I mean? Wherever they want.
Okay, yeah. I need to add this to my list of movies because I have just started watching movies again recently. I've spent years just not seeing movies really. So yeah, I will add that to my list. Thanks.
Yeah, well, you'll like it again. And of course, there's that juxtaposition of, shamanistic dancing, and in the blacks, it's the blues. That's how they summon the trickster devil and all that.
Ooh, the
But
voodoo.
then, but then the vampire starts doing these old Irish songs and things, and it is this beautiful comparison of these two cultures. In the movie, they're obviously fighting because one wants to eat the other, but it does shed a light into the plight of these magical animistic traditions that were lost and had to go underground, and what they're doing, and to survive. So
fascinating. Great
well,
intro. Absolutely, we'll check that out.
yeah, I want to hear your thoughts. It's sort of a weird synchronicity because in the last 2 weeks, it's interviewing Irish people about Gnostic Knight Templars and other syncs about Ireland just everywhere I go. So I'm like, oh my God, it's my Irish side must be calling to me to say, hey, there's something we must look at because our ancestors and our culture, regardless of how many or how mixed, they're always calling upon us. The spirits are always calling upon us for some mission or another.
Actually, in the Irish literature, the old Irish literature, it's where I find it's almost easier to find experience of this kind there than anywhere else. So that kind of is interesting in of itself, and just it's everywhere. It's in the poems, it's in the folk ballads, it's in the mythology, it's especially in the Irish, the lives of the Irish saints. Like in the first chapter alone on the Vardogger, I think there are like maybe a dozen or a dozen and a half accounts from Irish saints. And to be honest, I could have put dozens more there, but it just would have been too repetitive, But yeah, there are so many accounts of all the experience types in this book, represented throughout the lives of specifically the Irish saints, which I do personally find interesting.
Oh, I bet. So much rich culture and all traditions. But yeah, Ireland certainly has must have a lot of portals
It's just
by what
better.
we're saying.
Let's just
Just
say it. It's
better.
better. We'll just say it. We're just better. We're just better people.
There you go. And humble too. Very humble. I
Humble,
could say very humble.
as humble as it gets.
Yeah. Proud of your humility.
Absolutely. We're the best at it.
Awesome. Yes. Well, as we get to the end, Graham, do you have any last remark or question for Daniel?
I was just going to say, I think Cassidy from Preacher kind of spoiled Irish vampires for me for all time. He's just too great of a character. But
Oh
as
my
far as
God. Yes, God, I'm remembering that. Yes, the drunk. Yeah, he's an Irish vampire, but he's still drinking and gambling. It's like he can't get that out of his system.
No, it has to be there. Let's be honest. If anything, that
especially
begins
after
the path to vampirism.
yeah, especially after I met Glenn Fabray, the artist, who basically Cassidy was a self-portrait of him. He looked exactly like him, and in a lot of ways acted a lot like him. So,
Interesting.
yeah. No. As far as for Daniel, I was curious. Bringing it full circle to the Vardogger, has he explored connections with the Eastern concept of the egregore? Because that seems to be very connected in a lot of ways to like the morphogenic fields and the parapsychology and such. Okay.
Not specifically right into the Vardogger. Did Joshua Cutchin write on the egregore?
It was oh my God. Yeah, I've interviewed him many times. He put out the great book Egregores. Somebody in the chat can remember book Egregore. Let me look this
up. Your question is, I don't necessarily. It may be the case that you could bring that in some examples where there are multiple people involved, but like for most of the examples in this work, and this is what's interesting about the accounts of the Vardogger, and especially, and I don't know why that was that was just my personal favorite chapter. I really enjoyed writing about it, and there's something. So with the egregore and the idea of the collective kind of the thought forms influenced by multiple people. Again, the thing about the Vardogger is that the intimation of the visitor's arrival comes in many different ways and forms. So I wouldn't be able to just put it down to one phenomenon such as the egregore. Like, for instance, you have it in the dream, but you also have it in clairvoyance, for example. Like there may be a Siberian shaman who will use his drum in order to leave his body, and then specifically use that in order to sight people coming in at a distance. Whereas you may have witches in Italy who ingest a specific type of brew or plant in order to do the same thing, and then inform those around them of visitors who are going to arrive. This comes up in so many different sources. Like there was a source from New Mexico, from Mexico in 1681, where the same reference was made. I found it important to check the kind of as many of the early sources as possible to make sure these weren't just like colonially imported traditions, etc., because you do find that. But the reality is, with the Vardogger phenomenon, yeah, there's so many different ways in which it manifests, and yeah, it's just. I'll just say this last thing on the Vardogger is that one of the stranger kind of consistencies with these accounts is that it often comes up in relation to food. Like people will say, like, "Oh, I started." The individual will arrive home and see that there's food cooking, and they will say, "Why is there food cooking?" Because I had a dream you were coming home, for example. But I want to make it clear, like these aren't flippant illusions. Okay, these are anthropologists and ethnologists. For example, folklorists. For example, social scientist Barry Tolkien had this experience among the Navajo, where he would find himself arriving and there would already be food ready for him. And he made it very clear he had no idea how this was possible because there was no specific time of arrival arranged. There was no specific, there was no phone. They had no cell phones, etc. He makes it very clear that he doesn't know what this means, but he doesn't know how to explain it. And then there are many other ethnologists and anthropologists in the book who have this same experience when they're visiting indigenous cultures. For example, they will be greeted upon arrival, and they will say, "How did you know I was coming?" And they will very specifically say, "This is how I knew you're coming," whether it's the dream, the vision, etc. It's when you see literally dozens and dozens of these in a row that it becomes more compelling than these 2 or 3 anecdotes that I can give right now.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah. And for the audience, as Graham mentioned, the show Preacher, if put that on your list, Daniel, the first season is really good and it starts to drop off, but first season is incredible. Very Gnostic with the plots of, God quits heaven and Satan tries to, very Gnostic ideas, but
So
yeah.
it's
And
emo guy.
yeah, and yeah, and then of course the drunken gambling Irish vampire is one of the protagonists.
Selling point number one for me.
So awesome. Well, we are at the end. Where should they check you out? I've got your link tree on the show notes. That's pretty much it.
Yeah, and just if you want to get a copy of the book, Telepathic Tales, you can find it on Amazon.com and u.co.uk from my publisher, Inner Traditions, and pretty much all good bookstores.
Get it. It's a good book and yeah, highly educational, entertaining, eye-opening, and just amazing. And yeah, we look forward to your third book, the trilogy that's going to happen. So
Well, I'll say that will technically be the fourth book because I have a third coming out in February before that. So this one
oh,
hasn't actually, I haven't even submitted this manuscript yet, but I'm hoping that it will see the light of day. But yeah, I will have a book coming out in February dealing with the phenomenon of deja reve, which is the idea that somebody dreams of somebody before they meets them, and the entire book will be dedicated to this phenomenon. And yeah, it's something that I found so commonly in the legend, lyric, and lore that I simply couldn't ignore, and I just made a poem, and I didn't know it. So, pay me.
well, we certainly, yeah, we look forward to chatting with you about that when it comes. I hope you have some anecdotes of the wife or girlfriend who's mad at you for cheating, for you cheating on her on the dream. That's always a fun one.
Oh, there are those. Oh yes, it's been there have been breakups for these reasons.
Yeah, it's the dream. Awesome. Well, yeah, get the book and yeah, appreciate everything. First, I will say thanks, Graham, for keeping us company.
Oh, always my pleasure. And I say, pay attention to those fair doggers. Forewarned is forearmed.
Well said.
Amen. Amen. For the audience, thanks for being here. Saw some good comments. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed. And Daniel, as always, it is a pleasure having you on Aeon Byte. Really appreciate your time and the work you're doing.
Thank you so much for the invite. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure's all ours. And for everybody else, as I say, yeah, keep writing your own gospel, living your own dream, your own dream. Yeah, write your own gospel, live your own myth. But yeah, definitely keep dreaming your own dream. Or as a recent guest said, keep hallucinating the right reality. Nothing wrong with that. And that was
I like
James
that.
True. All right, everybody, take care. And we will talk to you soon. Good shows coming. Stay tuned.